So I'd like to acknowledge that today we are meeting virtually together in Dufferin on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. I'd like to acknowledge that the original peoples of this land experienced genocide and forced removal that persists today in systems of oppression and practices of colonization. I commit myself to actions of decolonization and societal change that centers diverse perspectives of marginalized communities. I'd also like to acknowledge the queer and trans activists and elders that came before me and made it possible for us to be here today, talking openly and relatively safely about 2S LGBTQ+ identities and experiences. In many parts of the world and in some communities in Canada, it is not safe to do so. I am a white settler raised by a mother who immigrated to Canada from England and a paternal family that settled in Pembroke, Ontario and Arcola, Saskatchewan as Irish, French, and British peoples who benefited from the riches and nature of Canada as a privileged people. My ancestors did not experience the residential school system or the attempted erasure of their languages or culture. I commit to constant listening, learning, and action towards justice, including the calls to action set out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Stevie, and I'm the 2S LGBTQ+ coordinator at DCAFS. I'm so thrilled to welcome you here today on International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. This day was created on May 17, 1990, when the World Health Organization officially declassified being gay as a mental health disorder. Each year, this is an important day where advocates around the world call on local authorities and decision makers to recognize and support diversity of sexual identity, and gender expression. So this year, together with the Orangeville Library and Dufferin Child and Family Services, we are proud to bring Peyton Thomas to speak about his writing and his debut novel, Both Sides Now. In our planning for the event today, our goal was to give credit to the power of the story and the amazing youth storytellers who are rewriting the narrative on diversity and pride. At DCAFS, I'm lucky to know an amazing group of youth through our weekly drop-in 2S LGBTQ group called GLOW. I want to thank these youth of GLOW, also as well our always supportive DCAF Executive Director Jennifer Moore, Penguin Random House Canada, and our good friends at the Orangeville Library. So with a warm welcome, I'd like to introduce our author tonight, Peyton Thomas. Peyton Thomas's debut novel, Both Sides Now, was named a young adult book to watch for by the New York Times. Both Sides Now was also named one of the top 10 young adult books of 2021 by the Globe and Mail, and one of the best Canadian young adult books of 2021 by the CBC. Peyton's writing has appeared in Vanity Fair, Billboard, and Pitchfork, among other publications. He was a 2016 Lambda Literary Fellow and a 2014 recipient of the Norma Epstein Foundation Award in Creative Writing. He graduated from the University of Toronto in 2015, majoring in political science and sexual diversity studies. He also hosts Joe Boys, a podcast about Lou Alcott's Little Women and the classic novels Unsung, Queer, and Trans Legacy. So I'd like to welcome and invite Peyton Thomas onto the virtual stage with us tonight. Thank you, Peyton.
Hello, welcome everybody. I'd like to thank Stevie, Lauren, and everyone from the Orangeville Public Library and Dufferin Child and Family Services for having me. This is such an important day. Stevie did touch on the origins of the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. This is a long-standing tradition in the queer community. It, like as Stevie said, it was conceived in 2004. It often feels to me as though these days kind of pop up more and more every year. Like I'll wake up and it'll be the day of visibility for trans masks with really cool little mustaches. But no, this is a day that goes back a long, long time. It was conceived by Louis-Georges Tine, who is a Frenchman from Martinique, who has done incredible work for gay rights worldwide. Now the day is organized by Tamara Adrian, who is one of the first trans legislators in Latin America. When I start to feel hopeless or worry that that we're in a dangerous, difficult moment for trans rights especially, I often look to people like Louis-Georges and Tamara, and I see people who have been fighting this fight longer than I've been alive. And it does help me understand that I'm part of a tradition of people and of activists, of writers, of creatives, of artists, of politicians, of all these people working to push for a better world, for more safety, for more freedom of expression, for all the trans and queer people around the world who are suffering. So I'd like to give my thanks from afar to Louis Georges and Tamara and all the people working to make this day such a special one. And with that, I will start into reading from my book, Both Sides Now, which is available wherever fine books are sold and at your local library. Orangeville, I'm looking at you. I would love to be there in the library today. It looks like there's some beautiful Winnie the Pooh type architecture that I would love to investigate, but I will just have to wait until things clear up a little more. Anyway, I'm going to be reading from Both Sides Now. It's the story of a 17-year-old boy who is trans and makes it all the way to the National Debate Championships, only to learn that if he wants to win, he may have to argue against trans rights. He's just learned in this scene that the resolution for nationals will be something about transgender rights and bathrooms, and he's sitting down with his debate partner, with whom he's a little bit in love, to figure out what on earth they're going to do about it and how they're going to argue the case. All right. Jonah opens his laptop and starts to type. This house would allow transgender students to use, what was the exact wording again? Transgender students in public schools, I correct him, licking salt from my fingertips, to use the bathroom facilities of their choice. Hey, Jonah turns to me. He stopped typing. Are you okay debating about this? I mean, my first instinct, my knee-jerk, is to tell him, yes, of course. Why wouldn't I be okay with this? I'm a debater. Devil's advocacy is what I do. What we all do. This isn't any different from Jonah with his nuclear power, no thanks button, arguing for atomic annihilation. I mean, it shouldn't be different. I don't want to be different. Just about everyone at Johnson is clueless about my being trans. Not Jonah, though. We've shared hotel rooms, shared beds even. He's seen me late at night in my pajamas, binder shucked. There was that one weekend he strolled out of the bathroom we'd been sharing, toothbrush still in his mouth, and asked, "Hey, what's with the rubber dick on the towel rack?" I had a whole entire heart attack, started apologizing, launched into this frantic speech on the care and keeping of Packers. Jonah just held a hand up. "No worries," he said, still brushing, and then stepped away, spat into the sink. "It's a nice dick," I heard him say over the flow of the faucet. "You've got good taste in dicks." I've always been grateful for the way he handled that. Like it was normal, not something I'd have to apologize for. I'd hate for Jonah to feel like he has to handle me with kid gloves. "I'll be fine," I tell Jonah flatly. It's not the first time I've argued for something I didn't believe in. Jonah falls back into the cushions, chewing hard on his lip. "You remember that one tournament in Tacoma," he says, "when we had to be anti-gay marriage?" Of course I do. I still remember how worried Jonah was when Adjwa read us the resolution, how ashen his face looked. "You talked about us boycotting the tournament." Right, because I want to get married, obviously. But then, remember, we started doing research, and we found all those gay activists from the 70s saying, like, we don't want a world where it's only okay to be gay if you get married. And I didn't agree necessarily, but I could see where they were coming from at least. And we used that stuff to build a case I could live with. He shrugs, scratching at the side of his nose. "Do you think there's anything like that for this issue, like a pro-trans argument against the bathroom thing?" I shake my head. I'm not sure. "Well, what about safety? For trans kids, I mean." Jonah leans toward me. "We could spin it like, hey, it's not safe for these kids to use the bathroom of their choice because they might get bullied there." Huh. For the first time since I read the resolution, I feel that familiar flicker in my chest. Hope. That could work. I reach for my own laptop. Lots of trans people are afraid to use public bathrooms. I mean, people everywhere, even in places that don't have these laws. On his keyboard. "Are you?" he asks, with the tone of someone who regrets what he's saying as he's saying it. "Afraid?" I open my mouth, I close it. I have no idea how to answer him. We hardly ever talk about my being trans. We definitely don't talk about my bathroom habits. "Not really?" I manage finally. "I mean, not in the last, year at least. Because you Jonah's hand works in the air, wrist spinning in circles as he searches for the word he wants. Because you look like a... Because you... I'll put him out of his misery. Because I pass? Yes, yeah. There's a nervous flicker in Jonah's laugh. Didn't know if I was allowed to say that. Oh, you're not. I laugh, shaking my head. Definitely don't say pass. Got it. He nods. I just wanted to know if it made things easier for you. Well, sure. I don't get weird looks when I go into the men's room anymore. Although, God, this is mortifying. Who wants to tell their friends how they poop? I have to use a stall sometimes, and if they're all full or there's only one and it's out of order or whatever, I have to go to the women's room, which is not ideal. Jonah winces. I can imagine. Can you, though? You, Jonah Cabrera, strolling right on into a women's bathroom going, sorry, ladies, the little boys' room was full. He laughs out loud. Okay, no. I can't actually imagine that. I can imagine the embarrassment, maybe, but yes, the embarrassment. I bring a hand down on the couch between us. My palm leaves a crater. Thank you. This is the trans debate, and it's the most embarrassing issue possible. It's not marriage. It's not adoption. It's... I lower my voice, very aware still that Jonah's little siblings are playing in the room next to us. It's peeing. God, Jonah sighs, raking a hand through his hair. These conservatives were really like, okay, how do we make these people look gross? I know, let's only ever talk about them in the same sentence as taking a shit. Through the wall, a chorus of giggles. Jonah said a bad word. Taking a poop, he calls back, but they only giggle harder. Toto, Jonah's puppy, joins in too, barking uproariously. Jonah looks at me, exasperated. Kids these days. They've got a point, you know. I nod to the door, where Renata and Benji are still howling with laughter. The bathroom debate isn't just gross, it's grown up. You can't talk about it around kids. You just can't. And that plays into this whole idea of trans people, especially women, being rapists or pedophiles or Buffalo Bill. Right. Jonah taps on his keyboard, scrolls down the dock, all business. Well, okay. Looks like we've got a good start on the pro-bathroom side. Now, how do we argue against it? I stare down Google. I swallow. I've typed transgender predator into the search bar. The cursor blinks and blinks. My hands rest on the keyboard. They do not move. Jonah tilts his head to look at the screen, sees what I've written. His face goes soft, and he says in a low voice, I'm sorry, Finch. That little flicker of hope I felt before, gone. I clear my throat. It's fine, I tell him, really. And I can tell by the look on his face, his arcing brow, that he doesn't believe me. Hell, I don't even believe me. At least the rounds only last, like, half an hour. There's a hopeful bit of uptalk in his voice, some optimism. Half an hour is not a long time. I sit for a moment, silent. Chewing on this, chewing on my lip. Jonah is very right. Nothing in me wants to stand up, say that people like me are predators. But it's just half an hour. Just pretend. That's not so bad, is it? If I want this win, if I want to get into Georgetown, what else can I do? So that is just a little taste of Both Sides Now. It's my debut novel. It came out last year in August of 2021 during the pandemic, in kind of a brief window where I was lucky enough to be able to do an in-person launch, but I've kind of been doing a mixture of in-person and virtual events ever since then. But it's been really lovely to connect with people, whether it's in person or virtually, and just talk about this book and what it means to me. So as Stevie said in the introduction, I'm Peyton Thomas. I'm a writer. I've written for magazines like Pitchfork, Billboard, and Vanity Fair. I grew up in Vancouver, BC, so other side of the country, and I was lucky enough to attend a private school where I was big into debate. In the back of my book, on the About the Author page, it actually says he was the captain of the debate team at his all-girls high school. So that tells a lot. I've had the pleasure of, since this book came out, kind of getting back in touch with my high school classmates, telling them about my transition, which has been a fun intro. Always fun to say, hi, we haven't spoken in 10 years. I'm a man now. But it's been really lovely, especially since some classmates have reached out to say that, you know, just like me, they were struggling in high school with their sexual identities, thinking of how to come out. And it's been interesting to learn that I wasn't ever as alone as I thought I was. One girl actually reached out to tell me that she's getting married to her partner later this year. She was really struggling throughout high school with coming out. And, you know, she sensed that I was having a hard time too. There was sort of, we're getting into the nitty gritty here, but towards the end of my senior year, I actually had to leave home because of just, I didn't feel safe. My mother was quite homophobic and made threats, and I wound up finishing high school living at a friend's house. And this girl I'd known in high school wrote to me and said, you know, I remember not seeing you in class for a few days, and I had a bad feeling, but I just didn't feel that I knew you well enough to reach out or see if everything was okay. So it's a mixed feeling looking back at moments like those, but ultimately I think it's clarifying and helpful to know that I wasn't ever as alone as I thought I was. And it's encouraging to go to these events nowadays and see people, you know, in high school who are just like completely out and proud, claiming their identities, you know, coming to events with other queer friends, coming with their, you know, their high school sweethearts, and to just know that life is now so different than it was when I was a teenager. I was fortunate enough to go to like a relatively liberal school, to live in an urban environment where, you know, there was a pride parade, there were LGBT events that were going on. In my final years of high school, my school was just kind of getting started up with the GSA. Nowadays, I feel like that's almost taken for granted. But I really needed that kind of cultural antidote because my family was very conservative, very Christian. I was in a family that went to church 3 times a week. You know, I would teach Sunday school on Sunday morning. I would go to youth group on Sunday afternoons. I'd go to Bible study on Friday evenings. Sometimes there were also like midweek events, camping trips, retreats, like summer camps, you know, the whole gamut. And my church was actually, I feel like it would have been a hard situation for any person growing up in a religious denomination that isn't welcoming of LGBT people. But my church was one of the last Anglican churches in Canada to not recognize same-sex gay marriages, right? I say same-sex marriages because that's the kind of the language they use. They talk about same-sex marriage, same-sex attraction, right? It was never actually like gay identity. It was always couched in these terms of like same-sex attraction as maybe like a disease that you might have or something you might be struggling with. So at that point in time, this would have been in kind of the late 2000s, the Anglican diocese in Vancouver had moved to recognize gay marriage. And my church was one of the holdouts that said, no, we're not going to do that. And the Anglican diocese said, well, that's your right. If you want to be a church community and not recognize gay marriage, like neither we nor the Constitution of Canada can really stop you, but you do have to give us our property back because the church building, the church grounds are owned by the diocese. So my high school years in this church community were completely wrapped up in this legal battle that eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada about whether my church would be able to hold on to this property or give it away. And of course, the central, like the reason this case was being fought at all was over gay identity. And you can imagine how hard that was for me, a person who was like, you know, Googling at night, how to deal with same-sex attraction, am I gay quiz, right? What is transgender? To deal with those feelings and those thoughts in the context of, you know, like a federal legal battle where, you know, gay people's right to love one another was the central focus. It was incredibly difficult. And I didn't really have people I could reach out to at church to talk about those feelings and feel safe, which was difficult because my childhood was kind of hard for other reasons. My parents split up when I was a teenager, and I really depended on that church community for emotional support. It was important to me to meet with my Bible study group and like share how difficult my week had been and pray with them. And it was not helpful when, we'd periodically have lessons about how being gay is evil, actually, and we have to defend our church from the evil liberal diocese. I have a strong memory, too, of when I was 16, going to an older person in the youth group and kind of in a roundabout way saying, well, like, if a person has gay feelings but doesn't act on them, is that a problem? And this person actually kind of coming back to me saying, yeah, I know from personal experience, I've had gay feelings as well, and this is how I've tamped them down, which was perhaps not what I needed to hear, perhaps not what anyone needed to hear. And it was just wild that that was the support that was offered to me. By contrast, at my school, the counselor I was seeing when my parents were splitting up was literally the mother of Tegan and Sarah. They were her daughters. They came to the school and did signings and charity events sometimes. And the approaches could not have been more different. And when my mother found out that she was Tegan and Sarah's mother, she actually made me stop going to counseling and said, if you have problems, you can take them up with your pastor. So for a long time, I just didn't have any kind of meaningful support. And it wasn't until I kind of got online and began making friends in fan communities for shows like Glee, artists like Lady Gaga, that I began to really befriend queer people, for one thing, and also begin to see, queer people in a different light. Part of what was happening at this point, I'd kind of gained enough independence that I was able to go downtown on weekends and go to the bookstore, go to the big chapters on Granville Street, and just sit there for a whole Saturday and read whatever I wanted. And more often than not, these were gay interest books or what little queer YA existed at the time. I would tell myself that I was reading these books to know my enemy or to be a light for Christ, but I knew what was really going on. I was sort of out to myself by about 16 and figuring things out. So really the teen section at the bookstore, the teen section at the library where these books would be held were refuges for me, places where I could reach out and learn more and read stories. And at the time, obviously, my choices in that department were much more limited than they are today. A lot of what I was reading was actually kind of just online stuff, fan fiction written by other queer teenagers. But it was enough of kind of a light at the end of the tunnel that I began to change my approach. When I was 17, like I said, in my final years of high school, a GSA was starting up. It happened to be meeting at my school the same day as the Christian Club. And I lost a few friends when I started going to the GSA instead of the Christian Club. I again told them that I was going to be a light for Jesus, but I think they knew what was going on. And it was difficult in those last couple of years to kind of increasingly be pulled in this one direction and have to justify it and make excuses for it to the Christian side of my social circle, which was still, I had good friends there. They were a really important source of support for me as with other difficulties in my life. And I think the moment that I kind of finally broke from that was in my senior year of high school, quite close to the end, where my church had a speaker from a local organization, which I am going to name and shame. They were called Living Waters. And they had a speaker come in who was dealing with same-sex attraction and just broke down crying in front of us, talking about how hard this struggle had been and how, he was working with Living Waters and with God to remove these temptations. And it struck me then that this was just not a humane way to treat people. I remember sitting in the car on the way home afterwards, just thinking, I can't condone that. It's not okay. Seeing him shake and sob in front of our youth group, I just knew that this was not something I wanted to be a part of any longer. And that sort of caused the rift that eventually led to me leaving home, finishing high school, living with a friend, it also, you know, eventually led to me coming out as bisexual in my first year of college. And so I've kind of talked a lot so far about like same-sex attraction, but not so much about being trans. And that, you know, that came later. There was, as hard as it was to find any kind of queer content in high school, as much as I had to kind of go into like the dark recesses of the library and the bookstore for that, the notion of transness was just kind of alien to me. Like, this was a moment in the culture where when trans people were mentioned at all, it was some late night comedian making fun of trans women. It was shows like South Park or, you know, Family Guy making jokes at trans women's expense. Like, there just wasn't a lot. And again, it was sort of the emergence of transness on websites like Tumblr and Twitter that showed me that this was even a possibility. It was making friends with other trans people that allowed me to consider that this might be something I could have for my own life. So I first came out as bisexual, then came out as a lesbian, then kind of lived for a while as like a non-binary lesbian. I changed my name. I started using they, them pronouns socially. I got the chop, the haircut. Not that there's any right or wrong way to transition. I'm just talking about my own story. My friend Ian came with me to kind of buy some male clothes and a binder. And that would have been around kind of my third year of university that I made that big change. I was in this wonderful program at the University of Toronto called Sexual Diversity Studies, where like literally everyone, professors included, was queer. And it was it's to the point where it was almost jarring when like I would leave, you know, these classes where we were like millennia ahead and go to like a poli-sci class where someone was misgendering Chelsea Manning. It was just the places that the culture was in. It was very different. And then I graduated and kind of like entered the workforce and immediately like felt all this pressure in like these public policy office jobs I was doing to be feminine and like wear heels and makeup and dresses. And that was kind of like professional attire. It wasn't until I was 3 months into my first job and it kind of like secured the health insurance that I felt comfortable asking my colleagues to use they, them pronouns for me. I had another experience at a second job where like I was using they, them pronouns and my boss asked me to write them out of my profile on the website. I was, you know, asked to dress certain ways. So in those years post leaving the utopia of sexual diversity studies, I really regressed almost. Like I kind of had to put the transition on hold. A lot of my male clothes went to the back of the closet. And so what happened to change all that and move me to think harder about my identity and what I wanted my transition to look like was that toward the end of 2017, I fell in love with a boy. And at this point, I would have described myself to anyone as a non-binary lesbian. I had pretty much ruled out men, but I really fell in love with this young man in a way that I couldn't ignore and had a really hard time thinking it through. I was like, am I a bisexual woman? Was I wrong? And I came to realize that I was in love with this man as a man. And that put my previous relationships with men in a whole different light. Like in high school, I had dated 2 boys, both of whom later came out as gay. And when I called one of those boys up and told him about my transition, he just laughed and said, yeah, that makes sense. Even when I was straight, I wasn't really straight. So around that time, though, coming to terms with these feelings, I would often look to popular media. I would, again, go to bookstores. I would, you know, comb through Netflix, looking, as I had done before, for like any little scrap of like something that would teach me how to be. And I couldn't find anything. And I remember just crying in my therapist's office saying like, I can be a lesbian, I can be a trans man, but being a queer trans man, that is just like not possible. Right? I didn't have anything in the culture showing me that it was even a possibility to do this. I had friends who were trans and had boyfriends. But I felt like it just was not possible in my own life. And I remember coming back to the therapist's office the next week, and she printed out for me like a little list of affirmations that were like, it's okay to be gay. I like who I am and I'm queer. And it was, and I remember just feeling embarrassed because I was like, I should really be past this. Like, I've been out for a long time. I have a degree in sexual diversity studies, for Pete's sake. Why do I need this? But there's a difference between knowing something intellectually and knowing it emotionally. So around this time, I started thinking about writing a book where a queer trans kid like me falls in love with a boy and it winds up okay. I didn't see any of those in popular media, and I was writing this book really to convince myself that it was possible. That book became Both Sides Now. It was written during the summer of 2019 on laptops and computers at the public library, because my own laptop was broken and I could not afford to fix it. So shout out to public libraries for making my literary career possible. And I was shocked when it sold. You know, I delivered it to my agent and was pretty much like, here's the first draft, let me know what you think. And he said, this is really, really polished. Like, I have a few things, but I think we're pretty much ready to go. And the book sold at auction in like 2 weeks. It was incredibly fast. I'm still shocked by that. And like I said, I wrote this at a time when I didn't see anything in culture that like even presented being a queer trans man as a possibility. And like, Both Sides Now is not even the only book in the year 2021 that depicted a queer trans man as the protagonist. Like, there are so many books now about that experience. There's books by Peyton Thomas, who is not me, although we have very similar names, Z.R. Eller, Emery Lee, Hal Shreve. There are tons. Like, we're in a really flourishing moment for literature about by and about trans masks. I will say, like, trans girls are not being served by YA right now, and that needs to change. We're just in a really incredible moment, though, that I certainly would have appreciated as a teenager, that I couldn't see coming when I was writing this book. So it's been interesting to arrive here and to feel like so much has changed, and that trans kids are, you know, they have more possibilities. They have more access to books that reflect their experiences than I ever had, and I really could have used when I was growing up. And, you know, it's a difficult moment for trans youth. I'm sure many of you have heard about the legislation in Florida that bans discussion of gender identity and sexuality from classrooms. So not sure how they're going to handle talk about like straight people getting married and cis people, but that seems to be the move. We've also seen a lot of just a ton of states ban trans participation in school sports, often at the expense of like a single person. In Kentucky, where a sports ban was passed, there was only one trans girl in the entire state playing school sports. She was a 12-year-old girl playing field hockey for her middle school team. And, you know, the Kentucky state legislature, you know, passed a law to stop her specifically from playing. It is just, it's unconscionable. It's really disgusting. I was really moved to see the Republican governor of Utah write a letter in which he pointed out that there were only 4 trans kids playing school sports in Utah and only 1 trans girl playing school sports in Utah. And he noted, you know, these trans kids aren't, you know, dominating or like knocking people over or taking scholarships. They are just 4 kids trying to feel like they're part of something and make some friends. And he said, never has so much hatred been directed at so few. He vetoed the law and said, I hope that if you override this veto, we can come up with ways to show these kids that we love them and that they have a place in our state. And I was deeply moved by that, like to the point where I can quote it like verbatim, but not enough people think that way. And sports bans are one part of the problem. Isaac Fitzsimmons, whose book, The Passing Playbook, is excellent. I didn't mention him before, but you should go check that out. It's all about a trans boy who's battling a sports ban and trying to play soccer. You know, Isaac wrote about sports bans. I wrote about bathroom bans. But now we're in a moment where states are banning children and youth from transitioning altogether. In some states, legislation has been proposed that would ban transitioning up to like age 25. And I genuinely didn't see that far ahead. I did not think that they would actually outlaw being trans, being a trans youth. So we're now in a situation where like Finch is, you know, a trans kid on hormones. He's transitioned, he's passing at his school, and his existence would be illegal in some of the states where this book is still on shelves, which blows my mind. And all this is to say, you know, on this International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, we're in a difficult moment. There are lots of reasons to celebrate, and there are lots of reasons to get really, really angry and fight back. And what Both Sides Now is about is, you know, it recognizes that the fight is ongoing, that we have a lot of work to do, but also that trans people, especially trans youth, have a right to live their lives and not constantly have to argue for their own humanity, to, you know, debate TERFs day in and day out, that they have a right to joy and ease and lightness and friendship and love and every good thing. So that's me. That's what Both Sides Now is about. I encourage people to live their lives, to not give transphobes oxygen, and to support other trans people, to seek out joy and camaraderie wherever we can.